Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video I'm starting a new series of retrospectives where we are now around the 10-year anniversary of Big Brother Canada, and from this point forward I plan on doing these yearly retrospectives on the series, obviously starting off here with Big Brother Canada 1. The first season of the show, and it very much feels that way, being a season filled with growing pains, to where obviously now the show does have its distinct identity, but I do feel like early on here they're trying to mold the show around the game of Big Brother US while also implementing aspects of the OG Big Brother format as well, and in turn ends up creating a season that ends up containing some really unfair twists and does set some pretty terrible precedents for the integrity of the game moving forward, and is really just something I don't think the show properly figured out until a bit more recently. And to be fair to this season, it actually gets worse across some of the future seasons, which has always been an issue with early BB Can seasons, as other aspects of the show are certainly better than what the US has given us in recent years, with production values always feeling grander despite its lower budget, and the casting has always been a major highlight, with this cast providing us with some all-time great reality TV personalities. And while the gameplay on this season might not be the most riveting in the world, this season has always stood out to me as one that I now have a level of nostalgia for, despite the fact that it's currently on the bottom half of my BB Can season rankings, but still gonna run through it anyway. So obviously, like my other retrospectives, we'll be talking about the season from beginning to end, and let's start off with the premiere, which this episode in particular I do have a lot of nostalgia for. Where at the time of the show's initial airing, I ended up rewatching the first few weeks worth of episodes over and over again. So I've watched this premiere quite a bit. It is a really bizarre episode to revisit now, and we started off with what is now the typical OTT intro you would expect from BB Can, but here we hear them talk about Big Brother has been spying on countries around the world, and now it's your turn, Canada, which, with this being the first season of BB Can, and with this series obviously having a major influence from Big Brother US, we do actually get a decent amount of references to the US seasons here, which obviously over time gradually fades away, with BB Can making a legacy of its own. But here we find out that 15 players will be playing this season, which is a really abnormal number. I believe BBUS has never done 15 players, and up to this point even, the typical 16 player cast was not typical at the time, with only BB9 and BB14 having them in the US, and those were due to extenuating circumstances. But with this somewhat larger cast here, and also its relatively short length, I mean this season is only 71 days, tied with the shortest Big Brother US season ever, it does allow this season to have a much quicker pace, with almost half of the weeks having more than one elimination within them, which makes it so there's not really a true slow point in the season, despite the gameplay becoming stagnant at points. And here we do also learn about the prize, which ends up being $100,000, a car, and a shopping spree at the Brick, which, I mean, just straight up is a pretty terrible prize. I mean, while there is no taxes on any of this, this still ends up amounting to about a third of the BBUS prize money at this point, even after the taxes and exchange rate, and the fact that the prize has remained the same since then feels just kind of pathetic, to where if you were to want to go on the show just for the money, I don't even think it would be that worth it, considering the amount of time and effort this experience takes, especially taking into consideration that this is only the money that the winner gets. I feel like if you're in Canada, why not try to just get on Survivor US at this point, where you make exponentially more money for less days and also get a larger payout for just showing up. So I've always felt like the prize money for BB Can's been pretty pathetic. Here we do get introduced to Arissa Cox, the host of the show, one that in the modern day is widely known as one of the best hosts in reality TV, and I support that opinion now. But season 1 is a very rough season for her, with her coming off as extremely awkward throughout, having some weird interactions with the players, and also being very loose with information to the players, to where that information could have easily influenced the game. And even as the players are entering the house, she ends up spouting some really awkward lines like, "You are the chosen ones." She tells them to get limber. She tells the last group that you're nervous and you should be. Tells them good luck with their game plans, and like all this is just super weird. But we end up having the players entering the house in groups of 5, with the first 5 to enter the house being the first 3 boots and the shield. But I really like the intros here, where despite them being pretty fast paced, which I mean really just goes for the entire episode, I feel like most people from this cast stand out from just this first episode. But Peter is the first to get introduced here, who has now become an extremely divisive figure, but was a pretty integral one to the first season here, being this massive standout at the time, and with him later hosting the sideshow, and I remember being subscribed to his YouTube channel post-season. I mean, he was a massive presence within the community, though I feel like that's kind of died off in the last few years, but he instantly comes off as a massive superfan here, being portrayed as the strategic mastermind, and with him also being a massive fan of Dr. Will, he comes into the house wanting to replicate Chilltown. And what do you know? There's another person on this cast with the exact same game philosophy, and that being Alec, which we later see them form the Shield, which they dub as BB Can's first ever alliance. And really, I feel like a lot of the decisions made by Alec and Peter here do stem from their love of Dr. Will and them wanting to replicate him, and also them wanting to set the tone for how BB Can is going to be played moving forward. Which in a way, I think you could say that that's a pretty egotistical way of playing the game, of coming in to set the tone of how the show should be played. But I do think it's a fascinating aspect of how they approach the show here that I think allows you to recontextualize a lot of the decisions that they end up making. But then we get introduced to Danielle with this really bizarre scripted sequence of her at a bar and like pushing people away as she talks about punching a guy in the face, which is just weird. But I mean, this first group ends up entering the house, leading to another funny moment to me of Alec and Neil being the first 2 to enter. And again, BB14 was very present in these people's minds, with that being the last BBUS season to air. And something I noticed here is that when entering the house, Alec and Neil essentially replicate Boogie's entrance to the house from BB14, where in that season he goes through the door, throws his bag, and says "Daddy's home," to which here we see the 2 do one part of his intro here, with Neil being the one to say "Daddy's home," while Alec throws his bag. I don't know if this was like coordinated, but I did find it funny how they both seem to come in with a similar philosophy of how to enter the house. But the next group enters, and this one ends up containing Tala, who gets this really OTT intro and ends up being this really humorous character across this season, though she does have a relatively quiet start to the season, with her not being that integral to the show until the midway point. But she does have a fun character moment here of her being scared of walking down the stairs in heels and ends up doing it backwards. But also Suzette gets a solid intro here of her talking about wanting to break stereotypes and represent for the curvy ladies. But I will say, I've always found Suzette extremely annoying, and that opinion's still held on the rewatch here. We also see content from Andrew, with him getting some strange content talking about how he wants to start a family, and they try to really ship him and Jillian in this opening scene of him saying he wants to find his Sandra Bullock, only for Jillian to then say that she looks like Sandra Bullock. And this ends up being pretty awkward, considering Andrew does end up getting a crush on Jillian across this season, only for her to end up with Emmett instead. But even beyond that, it is also weird to hear him literally say at the beginning of the season that he is there to find love, and he isn't gonna let the game get in the way of him finding love, which again like makes me question, like, why'd you cast him? Now, I think at the end of the day, I do think he is a fun casting choice here, but this is what he's bringing to his interviews. I feel like this should have been a massive red flag. But then we get to the final group, which provides a fun intro to Liza, who talks about being destined for reality TV and considering her perpetuate for drama, not just on this season, but also outside of the show. I feel like she was probably mostly right. Afterwards, we get introduced to Tom, who ends up dominating the screen time early on in the season, but he comes off as a massive douche here. I mean, when he's asked what he's looking for in the house, his response is titties. He then later talks about how gay people annoy him, and really his blatant homophobia really across a lot of this season is something that I just completely forgot about. And considering that this was only 10 years ago, I mean, this really was not a good look here. But immediately after he says that, we then cut to another of the stars of the show, and that being Gary, probably the most iconic character from this season, who becomes this massive fan favorite to the degree that I don't know if the show ever sees again, with him having near universal adoration at the time, and through that does benefit from Canada's later involvement in the show. But Gary's segment ends with him talking about loving country boys, leading to our introduction to Emmett, really the player of the season, the one that had the most agency and control across the season, and becomes the first "you should have won" guy. and even to this day, I still think he's one of the best players to never win. Though interestingly here, we do see him talk about his gay brother, to which his brother tells him to watch out for the gay guy in the house, which ends up being a humorous through line considering the fact that Emmett ends up losing the game here due to him trusting Gary too much. But now of all the players in the house, we finally get to see them interact, to which Gary instantly stands out with him being the loudest in the room, and he complains about their living conditions. During their introductions, he gets up and yells out, "I'm gonna speak." And yet all this is kind of putting a bullseye on his back, but also instantly we do see him bond with Emmett, to which we have him getting confessional about how he loves Emmett, which for some reason that DR is always stuck in my mind. But again, it is interesting to see how much Gary adores Emmett really throughout this entire season, only for him to cut him at the very end, which ironically loses him the game, though we'll talk about that later. But really, this all leads up to Arissa revealing that there is a phone in the house, and that this will dole out missions, which again is a takeaway from the OG formatted seasons like BBUK and BBAU, in which the players are tasked by Big Brother to do something to fill out time on the show, but if they succeed, they get a reward, which again is something that does make BB Can stand out from BBUS here, though I do think there are points where the tasks can have game ramifications, which I don't like this aspect of the players' games being harmed by something that production got them to do. But again, I think it's just a thing that you kind of have to accept with BB Can at this point, and really I don't think there's a major instance of these tasks affecting their games on this season outside the first time it happens here, where the phone rings, where we do have Suzette picking up the phone, and finally she ends up getting the secret mission in front of a big group here and is told to sneak to the DR, and we see her telling everyone that she didn't hear a thing, which clearly no one believes, and people instantly recognize that she's missing when she gets to the DR, though when she is there, we learn that through succeeding in her mission, she is awarded HOH, which, while it is iconic that this is how the show handed out its first HOH, it is also really lame that Suzette gets handed this just out of complete pure luck, though I will say it does lead to an explosive start to the season, where Suzette has to make her nominations just based off of first impressions, and we have Suzette talking about not enjoying this as it's a curse, which, I mean, it isn't inherently so, but I feel like the way that Suzette plays all this is just so wrong that it further secured her spot on the bottom. Now again, realistically, without this HOH, I think she would have been on the bottom anyway, but this was definitely a lifeline that she was given that she ends up just wasting and instead planting an even bigger target on her back. Or do get to the nominations, and she says that she's going to nominate you two guys, pointing at Tom and Emmett, who already by this point have clearly bonded, and we did see them being the last to enter the house together and clearly having a lot of commonalities. But this is really just a terrible move from Suzette, where by doing this, she is essentially creating a vendetta with the two most physical guys on the cast, two guys that will probably find themselves in the majority alliance, and in turn, most of the house is going to come after her after this. Now again, Suzette was probably going to be on the outside of the majority anyway, but I do think by nominating Tom and Emmett here, she just further solidified that, when she could have instead used this to nominate the likes of like an AJ or a Tala, who no one would have cared if they were nominated, and then used her HOH position to gain leverage in the game, but instead she just wastes this opportunity and further solidifies Tom and Emmett as a duo, with them securing their final two immediately afterwards, and this ends up fully backfiring on her even by the end of this episode, with us also getting the veto comp in this episode. Again, insane that they fit all of this into its first episode, but the veto ends up being a comp where they have to hump balloons to pop them and solve a puzzle, which again shows you that BB can be just as ridiculous as BBUS. But here we do see Tom winning the veto, to which we get more great hosting from Arissa and her awkwardly saying, "Tom, you finish your puzzle first, you win." But Tom winning here does take a lot of the power away from Suzette, with Tom now getting the leverage that Suzette should have been able to scoop up, with him essentially getting the credibility that the first HOH would typically get, and through that these initial power structures end up revolving around him and Emmett. But now let's talk about episode 2, which shows us the typical first week format of BB Can, which is something I've always hated, in that we get our first eviction in episode 2 here, really rushing through the first week, which is typically one of the best weeks in BBUS. But instead here we don't get much time to focus on the foundations of the house dynamics, and instead a lot of this episode has to be dedicated to recapping an entire week's worth of content, to which it feels like it just underserves everyone involved here, to where even the first boot doesn't get that much complexity here, with the show typically just mentioning the reason why they are targeted or dumbing it down to just one individual moment, when in reality there's probably a lot more involved there. But the episode itself does start with Tom getting veto-itis, I guess is what we're going to call it. And again, you don't typically see a person get so power hungry over just winning a veto comp, but Tom certainly does here, despite the fact that he doesn't even technically get his way here, where he does want to target Gary, with Gary annoying everyone with him leaving glitter everywhere, leading to a humorous scene of Neil wanting to further the target on his back by dumping the glitter around the house, to which he gets this big mastermind edit for, though again it ends up being really ineffective. And this is all because Kat is being targeted now for some reason. Now, we did get a scene of Kat trying to make an all-girls alliance, only for no one to be on board with it, and then we see Kat talking to Suzette, where Kat does come off as a bit aggressive in the talk, and that is obviously poor play from Kat, but she seemed genuine in wanting to work with Suzette moving forward, and was just frustrated that Suzette wasn't listening to her, and through this, Suzette decides to target her, which again is another really bad decision from Suzette here, taking out potential ally and furthering the power that the Tom and Emmett side of things have, with them still targeting Suzette moving forward, and them keeping all their numbers at this point. And Suzette further burns Kat on her way out, calling her a bully, and says she brings toxic behavior, and Suzette really just comes off as emotional in the way that she plays, not just here, but really the entire game. But with Kat now next to Emmett, Kat seems to be the easy target, but really it's like, why? I mean, like, considering how Emmett ends up running the game moving forward, I mean, this was really the only time he was eligible to be voted out until the final 3, which is kind of insane. Insane to think that there's no actual way to get Emmett out here. Like, we do see Liza and Neil campaign against him, and Suzette later ending up regretting the Kat nom, though considering by this point Quattro had already formed despite not being on the show yet, and Emmett had great relationships with the likes of Jillian and Gary, I really just don't think the numbers were ever there, as even Liza herself says that she doesn't think she can get the votes, and Suzette is already coming off as an extremely emotional figure and how bitter she is at Tom here, where they're talking about people want to have sex with Tom and that's why they'll target her, which is like, no, it's because you played poorly. But along the way, we do get some more lighthearted content with the players getting handcuffed for a day, to which obviously Tom and Gary get put together. And Tom seems miserable throughout the entire time, though at the end he talks about how this has transformed him, which we don't really get to see. We then also see the start of the Topaz-Alec showmance, with it being the first of many showmances on this season, but this one seemed to be the least genuine of them all, with Alec never seeming to really care about Topaz here, and he later drops her at the first opportunity game-wise, so again, this felt more like a fomance. But in the lead up to the vote, we do get more awkward interactions with Arissa as she asks them about their showmance and talks about, are you worried about the target it puts on your back, which again, I think it's her being very loose with game information there. But either way, we follow this up with a near unanimous Kat vote, with Liza being the only person to vote out Emmett, seemingly doing so to just cause some chaos, which is pretty apt with what you think Liza would do. But strangely, this episode does end with an interview with Dan Giesling, who has a lot of involvement on this season, which again, this is immediately after BB14, so Dan was very fresh in the mind, but his appearance here is such a throwaway, with Arissa literally just asking him a couple short questions like, who do you think's going to win the game, again from 2 episodes of content. But again, to me, this was a pretty pointless segment. But before moving on, let's talk about the boots in Kat, who, again, we didn't get to see that much of her here. I mean, she seemed to overplay her hand right away and wasn't able to recover from that, despite having allies on her side like Liza and Anil. But even those relationships are one that I feel like I had to interpret from the show more so than the show ever explicitly saying that they were her allies. But again, the fact that it was in Suzette's best interest to keep her around and Kat couldn't get her to do that is pretty bad and really indicative of how poorly Kat handled her here, and also the fact that she couldn't stay against Emmett, who should be such a blatant big threat, is pretty bad as well. So again, definitely has a lot of bad aspects to her game, though I think it's someone that could have probably had some potential had she just toned down her personality a bit. But now let's jump into week 2, which starts off with Endurance HOH, similar to that of Get a Grip from Survivor, of the players having to hold on to a log for as long as possible. And this is where we do see Jillian join the show after a very quiet week 1, and she wins the challenge here, this being her first of 4 HOH wins across the season. But here we get the setup of her rivalry with Danielle, which really comes out of nowhere here, with Danielle being upset that she won, as I guess there was some drama between the two over Emmett. Speaking of which, we do finally see see the Jillian and Emmett showmance, which obviously ends up dominating the game, but also at this point end up dominating the screen time of the week. But they didn't seem to be on the same page here strategically at first, with Emmett seeming to have a lot of other options in the game, while we do see Jillian and Liza become close at this point, with Liza continuously trying to turn her against Emmett, which never fully works, and it actually eventually turns Jillian against Liza. But this early on in the game, it did seem to plant some distrust in Jillian's mind. But here Jillian does end up pigeonholing herself with her nominations, which is not out of the norm for her considering her later HOHs. But here she makes a deal with Tala during the HOH, and also had previously made one with Suzette the previous round that did limit her nominees here. But it did seem like Danielle was her target at first, as someone clearly coming for her. And to back that up, we do get this notable scene of Gary and Danielle, who come off similarly to how like Brittany and Monet came off in BB12, of them spending all their time together trash talking the other players. And Danielle ends up calling Jillian a bitch and a hoe, and then proceeds to pretend fight her, which further supports that she should be targeting Danielle here, only for Jillian to end up being swayed away from that plan by Emmett, who does really effective work here in getting Jillian to target Neil instead. And it's someone that was more in her corner and that thought that they had a good relationship. But considering that Neil had previously campaigned against Emmett and also was starting to figure out the true power structure of the house, having literally called out the entire Quattro Alliance, which was running the show at this point, it did make Neil a pretty easy target here. But again, at this point in the season, for some reason, Quattro's like still not on their show, despite them being the alliance that's running the show at this point, and being the combination of the Shield and then Tom and Emmett final two, who again initially try to play similarly to the Brigade, and again Neil directly calls them out for that. And Jillian does seem to believe him at first and does test Emmett with this information, only for Emmett to completely turn it around on Neil, getting her to agree to now target him and use Gary as a pawn against him, leading to Neil being blindsided by his nomination, which again is a pretty bad move for Jillian. I mean, her just doing the dirty work of an alliance that she isn't a core member of yet, instead of targeting someone that again is directly coming for her. But through Neil's nomination, he continues to get this mastermind edit of him fake crying to Jillian, which is really an effective strategy. And what is really funny here is that we follow this up with a scene of Neil doing the same tactic on Emmett, to which Emmett responds by just laughing in his face, which this is what makes Emmett a really humorous character to me on the rewatch, where really Emmett is just a complete dick across this season. But for some reason, this cast was so wrapped around his finger to the point where no one was bothered by this. But it really comes off on the show here, where we see him being extremely cold-blooded throughout this season. And while this is a situation where Neil's obviously playing it up, we do get numerous moments afterwards of him just being a dick in a situation where someone else is being extremely emotional. Though to be fair, Neil's acting here is pretty bad, with him literally saying the line that Jillian is like Dr. Will and I got played. But then we get to the veto, which involves throwing snowballs, and Gary handily wins this one, being the point where I do think he starts to gain some respect in the game. So again, there's a lot of talk about how surprising it is that Gary would be good at physical competitions based on his demeanor, which comments like that haven't aged well, but with this, Jillian now needs a pawn to go up, leading to a conversation between her and Danielle, where Danielle offers to go up for some reason. Now, I get that she was expecting Neil to go home as the consensus house target, but when you're also someone that already had a hostile relationship with the HOH, and also isn't in any real alliances, it is a bit of a head scratcher of why she just openly volunteers here. Though realistically, I mean, the renom was between her and AJ anyway, and all this did was like obviously tip the scales towards her. But at this point, I mean, she genuinely wasn't the target, and ironically, despite her being Jillian's target at the beginning of the week, and it was Quattro that got the target off of her, it is now Quattro that actually puts the target back on her back, while Jillian is more ambivalent to this choice, where this all spirals through Liza leaking information to Peter about a possible girls alliance, again implying this Peter-Liza relationship that isn't focused on the show until a bit later, which again feels like a trend on this season of them introducing relationships a week after they first become relevant. But this does cause a bit of paranoia about Girls Alliance, to where Quattro switches their target to Danielle because she's a girl. But this is technically the first time the show shows the Quattro Alliance, again, at the end of the week, after they had already been controlling the game up to this point. But also they do make this move to isolate Gary as well, while also hoping to pull in Anil and use him as a mole for the other side. And this is where the Shield is shown doing pretty impressive work, coming off to Anil as his saviors, and also putting themselves behind Tom, as Tom is the main campaigner across this week, to fight to keep Anil around, which I do think the influence of Liza greatly factored into that as well, where Liza across the early game here is playing pretty aggressively with very mixed results. But this is where we do see the Tom and Liza showmance for the first time, and Liza is able to do some solid manipulation on him at points, especially if it's a move not against the core members of his alliance. But interestingly, Emmett doesn't get his way this round, with him still wanting Anil out by the end of it. And again, at this point in the game, the Shield, despite this notion nowadays about how overrated they are the ones in the best position. They are in the center of the house with no one targeting them, and they're also getting what they want done. But beyond this, we do see Gary starting to suspect that Anil might be staying, making him seem like the most perceptive out of the outsiders, though again that's not really hard to be considering that group is Danielle, Tala, and Suzette. But the blind side is set, though across the week we do get a number of other notable segments. We get the first appearance of Marsha the Moose, who really becomes the mascot of the show, though realistically these segments are just kind of stupid. Again, it is a moose head that doles out tasks, and it's, again, really campy, but it is something that makes BB Can feel unique. This leads to a fun segment of Peter trying to work in these random phrases into conversations, and through that they win a party. That does lead to some drama of Tom getting annoyed at Gary, Danielle, and Tala for sneaking away the vodka, leading to Tom fighting with them, perfectly exemplifying his personality there. But also here we do get Gary's fashion show, which is where we do get introduced to his first alter ego in Zowimber. But is also where we get Suzette's iconic line of "Hey boys." But following this we get to the eviction, where we get more of Arissa awkwardly joking around about how Topaz has slept the entire week, which was the joke online, but funny to see Arissa bringing this to the show, being the first sign of Arissa being this big fan who actually watches the feeds and pays attention to the community, which we all know of her today. But Danielle does get blindsided in an 8-3 vote, having a great reaction to the vote reveal, her mouth just dropping to the floor and her storming off and crying on her way out. And I mean, Danielle obviously played pretty terribly across this season. I mean, while she did have good relationships with Gary, Tala, and Suzette, those were really her only relationships, and those people were also on the bottom. And really, Danielle's boot here seems even worse considering the fact that she volunteered herself to be on the block. Now, I do think she is a terrible player, but I do think her eventual boot here was actually a bit more unlucky than I remembered, with the tide starting to shift towards her due to the paranoia over a women's alliance that didn't actually exist. Though, I mean, again, at the end of the day, Danielle was still aloof to the point where she didn't recognize that she was in danger despite Gary warning her, and doesn't campaign across the week, and really just in general is someone that I can't imagine ever doing well, as she just seems like a player that sticks to her group while coming off as insufferable to everyone else. But now for week 3, which ends up being a really explosive week and debatably the best week of the entire season, which starts off with the majority rules HOH comp, one that I've always loved that does test your reads on the remaining players, but something that wasn't shown on the show, but you can clearly tell by the way the comp plays out, is that the players had already found a way to game this comp before it happened, where the men do all agree to pick A no matter what question ends up coming up. And this comp obviously ends up going on for a while, with all the men remaining and all of them picking the same answers. And that is until Alec ends up throwing the comp here, exemplifying his greatest flaw moving forward of him being too openly schemy here, where again this entire plot was his plan, and for him to throw the challenge here makes it look to others as if he's just using them and making them do his dirty work, though this one doesn't end up backfiring on him as much as a certain other throw that he makes later on. But again, it all comes down to the tiebreaker between the men, to which we get the best possible outcome for entertainment here in Tom winning HOH, to which he ends up having a really disastrous reign here. Mind you, part of that is due to him getting screwed over by a twist, but even beyond that, this reign is probably one of the biggest examples of HOH-itis I've ever seen. I mean, making himself such a big target coming into the next round to the point where his own allies decide to flip against him after this. And even beyond that, most players lost respect for him across lost this week, to where I think it would have been very unlikely for him to win a jury vote if he miraculously got to the end. But instantly after Tom's win, we do end up seeing Suzette having a tantrum, and this is, to me, probably one of the biggest meltdowns we've ever seen in Baby Can. And it's a scene that just straight up reminded me of how much I hated Suzette back in the day, where we instantly see her calling out Tom for being disgusting and wanting to quit. She talks about Tom having a vendetta against her when what did she do to him? It's like, you literally targeted him day one, wanted him out from the very beginning, to the point where he is from that point on forced to play the aggressive game he has played. And also, she's been constantly bad-mouthing Tom behind his back. So the fact that Suzette is so incredulous to the fact that Tom would have a vendetta against her is so ridiculous. And Topaz ends up telling her this, to which she responds by saying that's so stupid. And we follow this up with Anil entering the room to cheer her up, only for her to start yelling at him, calling him fake, saying you've been backstabbing me this entire week. It's like, you literally just voted him out, and he was on the block the entire week. It's like, what do you mean? And then we get to this tirade about how the reason no one is working with her is because she's not sleeping with anybody, and really all this is so terrible from Suzette. And the funny thing is, Suzette wasn't even the target coming into this round. While she was on the outs and she would have potentially been used as a pawn, she was also just such a non-threat that Tom was still planning. She was such a non-threat that even after this blow up here, Tom is still planning to target Gary first, though this does further solidify a target on her back that just gets bigger and bigger as the week goes on. And Suzette never bothers to talk to Tom before the nominations here, while again continuing to badmouth him behind his back, all being really terrible play from her. But again, at the same time, we do see Tom and Emmett talk about how Gary still needs to be the target. And despite the show, again, ending up dunking on Tom moving forward, the show does also have some scenes here and there where they try to humanize Tom. Where, again, like at the end of the day, it's like he is being shown as a more rational player here than Suzette, which again isn't hard to do. But also we have the segment of him being in the room alone, crying when looking at pictures of his mom who has breast cancer. And again, he is portrayed as more of a sympathetic figure here, despite all the negativity that comes from him moving forward. But immediately after this, we do see him talk to Emmett, to where they agree that Gary is the biggest threat, which I will say the fact that Emmett continues to target Gary at this point in the game does seem mostly misguided from him, as Gary always seemed to want to work with Emmett, and it could have been a massive boon for his game to pull Gary in, but he just never really bothers to utilize him. But immediately afterwards, we do see Quattro minus Tom talk about him being a loose cannon, with Emmett worrying that he might not be able to rein him in, really setting up Tom's eventual downfall here from the very beginning of the week. Which over the course of this week, the Shield becomes more resolute in targeting Tom moving forward, which also seems misguided from their perspectives as well, considering Tom is such a blindly loyal player, but also one that takes the heat off of all of them, where yes, he is this very emotional player, but he's one that is never going to target you. And the fact that they break Quattro this early seems so misguided. And to go along with that, we do also see Alex starting to separate himself a bit from Topaz as well, thinking that it's putting a target on their backs. And I do think all this comes from Alex's overconfidence in the game, to where he thinks he has this very solid structure around him, but for some reason he sticks to those in his structure that don't actually remain loyal to him over these figures that would have, which I think is really the undoing of the Shield moving forward and them just picking the wrong allies. But this is also where we do see Topaz and Gary's relationship for the first time in their final two, called The Secret Wedding, where she does go and campaign for him to Tom, and also with the backing of Liza as well. Tom does end up switching his target back to Suzette and creates this plan to use the veto on Gary, to nominate Gary as a pawn, only to then use the veto on him and then use AJ as the pawn to secure the votes for her to go home, which, while not a terrible move on paper, it ironically ends up screwing him by the end of the week, but is also just a bit too much. And it really just shows you the amount of control that Tom assumed that he had at this point, that he thought this harebrained scheme would just go off without a hitch, which to be fair it does, but just due to the fact that he got extremely lucky in the fact that he won the veto. But again, the tension between Tom and Suzette just continues to build, where at the nomination ceremony, Tom calls her out in his speech, to which she ends up snickering. And really in the following episode is where a lot of Tom's negativity really comes to a head, where you can just tell how much he thinks that everyone's on board with his plan, and how everyone is loyal to him, when in reality, even Gary, the person who he is saving with this plan, is already talking about not liking him and potentially wanting to take him out down the road, and is only working with him in order to keep him safe for this week. Leading us to the veto, which ends up being a hockey-based competition with Tom being a hockey player, and he does end up winning here, but through this we do get some more drama, Suzette ending up accidentally eliminating herself, to which Suzette lashes out again and calls Tom a redneck, seeming like the last straw here, to where after this no one really ends up backing Suzette anymore, and it didn't feel like there was a way for her to survive this round until there's a twist, but the plan goes through as expected. Tom uses the veto on Gary, uses AJ as the pawn, AJ's first outing as the pawn star, which he later gets dubbed, and the Suzette boot seems to be so obvious to the point where most of the eviction episode ends up focusing on Liza instead, with her game starting to crumble across this round. Now here we do see Liza's relationship with Peter for the first time, which I never really knew how to interpret this relationship, where Peter's obviously into Liza, but Liza also had a showmance with Tom that seemed to be more of her focus, and I do think this played a factor into why Peter wanted to target Tom so early, as again, I don't think it made much game sense to do it this early. Now again, we do hear from the Shield talking about how they want to get rid of Tom to gain some clout in the game, but again, to me, it just feels extremely short-sighted to be doing this at the final 12. But here we also see Peter getting extremely confident that he could flip Liza on Tom, which Alec ends up rebutting, as, I mean, like, really, there's no way that's happening. And really all this seemed like an attempt from Peter to save Liza, as Liza becomes the target for the Quattro, with her starting to get more influence on Tom through Tom's saving of Gary and making a deal with him being a plan from her. And also here we do see Tom getting really jealous of the Liza-Andrew relationship, to where now he wants Andrew gone next. And this ends up fully cementing Emmett against Liza, but also makes Emmett fully realize that Tom is probably on his way out. And with Alec and Peter being too close as well, to where by this point, Emmett already knows that he needs to start looking out for some other endgame options. But across this week, we do also get some fun segments from Gary, with him revealing his more masculine alter ego in Gerald. And also we get a segment about how he doesn't know how to do laundry, which was funny. We also get a fun task from Andrew of him having to make the worst possible meal and have people compliment him for it. And this ends up turning into a personal segment for him, with him getting to talk about his late father's birthday and using that as the reason for the meal. But I did find it funny how Tom genuinely seemed to love the meal, while Andrew kept on talking about how god-awful it was. We also get this strange sequence of BB claiming that one of the players tampered with the cameras, and because of that, they're going to get punished with a random series of tasks, and this just straight up felt like production making something up so that they can hand them tasks and also potentially cause drama, especially because, like, we never see who tampered with the cameras. But either way, we get to the eviction where Arissa asks Tom if power has gotten to his head, which again felt like them telegraphing his perception in the game. But then we get to the reveal of the massive twist, the first Chevrolet power shift of the season, in that Canada has been given the power to save one of the nominees, which, considering how hated Tom was by this point in the game, obviously Suzette was going to be saved here, which is ironic considering all the negative content surrounding her across this week as well. But again, that's the issue with twists like this, where the public is typically just going to blindly vote for whoever the edit indicates is in the most danger, and this is essentially just handing immunity to that person, to the person that's most likely to go home. And we do see a similar twist like this in BB Can 6 that ends up backfiring on the producers more there, but in BB Can 1 here, I do think it does exactly what the producers intended in ruining Tom's plans here, but also I think it genuinely made for worse TV in the long run here, keeping Suzette in the game, who had no potential in the game at this point, and later ends up getting taken out during probably the most boring week of the season strategically, where everyone just agrees to take her out before jury. But also I think it takes out a player that had a lot of potential in Anil, where Tom is forced to name a renom after the commercial break, and it is there where we see Emmett do a really good job in getting Tom to take out Anil, despite Tom and Anil having a good relationship by this point, and Anil having started to rebuild some of his social capital across this week. Instead, he ends up getting sniped out of the game here, with Tom also having screwed himself by having used the veto on Gary, meaning that he couldn't put Gary up either, and Tom really makes a pretty suboptimal move here in putting Anil up, who again was one of the few players that was not going to be targeting him in the following round, though here we do see Jillian and Liza both try to save him to no avail. But again, after Anil's vote off, we get Arissa being once again pretty intrusive. They're asking Tom about what did Emmett say to him that led to his decision, which again is just production reminding everyone that it was Emmett's influence that got Anil out. But either way, again, losing Anil here I think is such a travesty, as Anil was a massive fan of the game, and while he started off on the outs, he slowly was working his way back in, and while realistically I don't think he would have ever been able to actually get that much control in the game, he was on an upward trajectory that his boot here largely comes off as pretty unfair here, being the first victim of these dumb twists that BB Can incorporated into the game, and will certainly not be the last. But again, I liked Neil on the show. While it did seem like he was getting this mastermind edit at points where it was completely unwarranted, I did like the chaotic nature that he brought to the show and was disappointed to lose him in such of a whimper here. But now for week 4, which ends up being another pretty crazy week, with this being the downfall of Tom, which ends up occurring in as dramatic of a way possible, where we do start off with the Bee's Knees HOH comp, which is one where you have to transport these balls without using your hands, and even in real time, we do have Tala and Jillian being called out for cheating, but eventually Emmett wins the challenge, to which Tom is obviously ecstatic, feeling like as if he won, and immediately campaigns against Suzette, saying that he wants to send a message to Canada, which I always found funny that he's essentially saying F you to Canada here, but clearly Emmett wants to target Liza instead, with her really being the only person left targeting Emmett at this point, and we do see a lot of relationship drama between Liza and Tom here, with her being upset over the Anil vote off, but also we get to Emmett's HOH, where he interestingly gets a letter from his family saying that they love Gary, which this would certainly not fly in the modern day. Again, continues this trend of production being very loose with outside influence, and I would not be surprised if this played a factor into Emmett's perceptions of Gary towards the end game. But eventually we get BB calling everyone to the living room, where it is announced that 4 players have been caught cheating in the HOH, including Emmett, to which he is now stripped of his HOH position, and they will be doing a new HOH comp where the cheaters will not be eligible, which is actually pretty insane here. Again, pretty unprecedented, stripping away one of Tom's best case scenarios here, leaving Liza really as his only hope. And here we do see Tom having to host the competition, and with him knowing the danger he's now in and how angry he is over how screwed over he's been the last 24 hours, it is really funny to watch him being just pissed the entire time he's hosting the competition, at least initially, considering the fact that they made a deal. Seeming like a decent outcome for Tom initially, considering the fact that they made a deal in the previous round. But to have that deal come back to bite Tom here is such a great comeuppance for him, but eventually we do see Gary wanting to target Liza at first, which is also ironic, as again it was Liza that got Tom to make the deal to keep Gary around. But we do see Alec throwing Tom under the bus, to which Gary ends up deciding to use Tom as a pawn, where even Emmett ends up giving Gary his permission to do so, and Tom obviously ends up going on a rampage now, feeling betrayed once he finds out that Quattro was in on his nomination, and talks about using the veto on Liza to spite them, which would have been really humorous if we got that, considering that would have been the Jed move, but like 8 years earlier. But he never gets the opportunity, as we do see Alec winning the veto here, though through that it does bring other really interesting dynamics here, with Tom obviously expecting Alec to use the veto on him as a fellow Quattro member, but Alec was really never going to use it. But even then, he does make a deal with Gary to not use it, and if he did go back on it, Peter would be the renom anyway. So again, Alec never had any incentive to use the veto here. Instead, use it as a way to build relationships in the game, particularly his relationship with Gary here. And I do think, considering he is cutting Tom here, I do think this is actually a decent play. Though again, I don't think it was the right time for him to drop Tom to begin with. And Peter outright says that the reason that they are cutting Tom here is because they don't like him, which obviously bad on Tom for being that bad socially, but also seems extremely short-sighted from these players that hype themselves up as the masterminds of the season. But we do get to the veto ceremony, which gives us one of my favorite lines in the history of BB Can, where when Alec asks why I should use the veto on you, Tom's response is, "The question is why, my answer is why not, bro," which has always been a really quotable line to me. But again, after the veto here, Tom being stuck on the block, the target did seem to shift towards him, with the plan being to blindside him so that he doesn't expose Quattro on his way out. Though really, I don't think that mattered that much, as Tom already confirmed Quattro to Liza, and really she already knew that Quattro was the thing anyway, and also the other players in the house suspected that they were working together. So again, this information wouldn't have been that detrimental, especially considering the Shield being two of the biggest proponents for taking him out. But Also, here we do get a lot from Emmett and his conflict with taking Tom out, considering he had been genuine about wanting to go to the final 2 with Tom, and he doesn't want to cut Tom, as it does worsen his position, but considering his refusal to cut Liza and how emotional a player he is, Emmett does decide to let him go here. But interestingly, we do hear from the Shield that they still intend on working with Emmett moving forward, which their loyalty to him despite them having their own numbers that they ditch for the sake of working with Emmett really ends up being their undoing moving forward. But some other notable scenes across this week are the have-nots having to give pedicures to the haves, to which we have Alec being Ricardo, and we get some awkwardness from Tom getting a massage from him. But probably the biggest non-gameplay moment ends up being this pretty bad moment for Tom on his way out, of him pulling a prank on Alec by opening the shower door on him while he's showering, to which Alec gets extremely emotional, being upset that he was potentially exposed to the internet. And again, obviously this is Alec being this big fan that knew about the feeds and how they operated. And obviously this is just terrible from Tom, something I don't think would be tolerated in the modern day. I think there would be grounds for expulsion if this was done today, and Tom doesn't handle this well either, joking around about it. And really, I don't think Tom did this in a malicious way. I just think Tom's just an idiot and really just thought he was pulling a prank on his friend, but didn't realize the ramifications of that. But again, still a really idiotic thing to do here, and does cause a lot of drama, especially with Topaz starting a fight with him. Though something I always found strange, the fact that they edit out Topaz also fighting with Liza here as well, with this fight essentially being the culmination of their rivalry, a rivalry that wasn't on the show, where they had really hated each other while in there. And I've always found it weird how, again, they didn't bother to show any of it. But by the time of the eviction, Tom does get blindsided, being a perfect conclusion to his downfall across this season, and we end it with a great goodbye message from Peter talking about how amazingly awful he is at this game and to not worry about Liza, as he'll keep him warm for him, which, I mean, sure. But again, we do lose Tom here, who, again, was all over the pre-jury of this season. He really dominated the screen time and provided the first of these like epic downfalls in the history of Big Brother Canada. Now, his arc on this season is nothing really unique. I mean, we've seen this type of storyline for this like figurehead of the Majority Alliance that gets HOH-itis and eventually gets taken out pretty soon afterwards. Like, this is a thing we've seen numerous times on BBUS and see on even BBCan numerous times moving forward. But Tom, to me, is kind of the definitive version of all this, where Tom just so perfectly fits into this role. And really, the tragedy of his story here is one that always sticks out to me when I think of this season. Now, surrounding that, again, he is a pretty terrible player and one that is pretty unlikable at points. Again, Tom as a character has simply not aged well, with him doing things that would simply not fly in the modern day. But the role that he plays on this season is one that I do think he played out perfectly. But with that, the week isn't over just yet. We do also get our first ever double eviction here, which sadly is a boring one, as Liza is the clear target and she goes out immediately after Tom here. But along the way, we do get a great HOH comp, which ends up being a knockout comp, which is obviously greatly disfavorable to Liza in this position, where everyone is against her. But it does play out in a fun way, where it comes down to Andrew and Alec, with Alec very openly throwing it, once again demonstrating the greatest flaw in his game of him being too openly strategic. But this ends up biting him a lot more moving forward than his previous throws, as Andrew ends up getting really annoyed and feels used at this point. So this ends up leading to him siding with Emmett over Alec in the coming rounds. But finally, Andrew ends up winning here, despite never getting an answer properly right, as again, he got to the final round through his opponents getting their questions wrong, and even in this final round, Alec had to so blatantly tell him the answer for him to get it right, which really makes you question, like, why didn't Alec just push the wrong answer? Like, that would have been the more optimal move for him to make here. But Andrew ends up doing the dirty work for the majority here and putting up Liza and Suzette. Emmett wins the veto, and Liza unceremoniously gets voted out, though she finally gives the exact same speech that she made earlier in the night against Tom. But also, it did feel fitting for her and Tom to go out the same night, and in doing so made this feel like an entirely new game moving forward. But Liza here is someone that I've always liked as a reality TV character, one that is willing to stir up chaos, and one that is a decent strategic thinker, that has decent reads in the game, but is also played as so openly that I feel like I would never actually have faith in Liza to do well on a season. I feel like she's always so ready to make big moves, so if she fails to make that big move as she did here, she'll end up being a target because of that. But again, she makes for good TV, knowing how to play things up for the camera. She gets involved in a lot of drama and showmances, and really she's just a fun player here, but also an extremely messy one. But now for week 5, which in the aftermath of the conclusion to the Tom and Liza storyline, we get one of the more boring weeks of the season, largely because the entire house agrees to get rid of Suzette because they didn't want her in the jury. And again, the round itself is pretty dull, though we do get a lot of interesting groundwork for how the rest of the game plays out moving forward, where this is where Emmett really starts to take control of the game and the Shield starts to make their bigger mistakes. But first, we do get a pretty iconic HOH comp, mostly because of one specific player, as the comp itself is actually kind of boring, of it being this like clear maze that the players have to go through and find out the code and say the code to open the key, to open the door to the car, which is the car that they win if they win the show, because they needed to advertise it more here. But the winner of this HOH also ends up getting $10,000, which is not too shabby for BB Can standards. And because of that, we do see Alec decide that now is the time to finally win HOH, where again, Suzette is this very clear house target to where he gets no blood on his hands, and also Suzette has sussed out the Shield as a threat, making this the perfect HOH for him to win on paper. I think the one downside is the fact that he is going to win this competition immediately after throwing a competition, which I do think really accelerates his threat level to the point where people are just assuming that he would have won these comps that he has thrown, making him come off as an even bigger threat here. And also the fact that he ends up using this HOH to take out Suzette instead of the likes of an Emmett or a Jillian or even an Andrew, in retrospect, is also a big misstep as well. But again, we do see Alec win, but really who cares, because the bigger moment of this competition is Tala's meltdown of her continuing to say the wrong number, her just adding an extra 9 every time she says it, and gets so frustrated at her continuously getting it wrong. It gets so hilarious to see her yelling at production as she doesn't know what they want her to do, and then she quits the challenge, only for her to realize just as she sits down what she did wrong. And again, it's just such a funny moment. Probably the most iconic moment for Tala here. But again, Alec is the HOH and gets the money, and surprisingly we do hear from Peter about how he plans on using the money Alec won against him later, which is really the only time the entire season I feel we hear from a member of the Shield talking about undercutting the other. So again, nothing really comes out of this, though we do get a fun moment this week of the Shield being in the DR together for the first time, to which Alec ends up mocking Peter for his yelling, which is a funny moment. The noms here are decided pretty early on, with it being Suzette and AJ as the Pawn Star, though we do see some campaigning from Andrew to put Gary up, which doesn't work obviously, but I do feel like this furthers this divide between Alec and Andrew, with Alec thinking of Andrew as a weapon for him to use moving forward, not realizing that Andrew is really a weapon for the other side, which we do see come together this week, with Andrew airing his frustrations to Emmett, which allows him to scoop up Andrew as a number here. And this is also the week where, again, Emmett sets up his endgame after having lost Tom, where he does solidify his final 2 with Jillian, and really from this point forward, they end up really running the show, detailing their strategy of riding the middle and then winning as many competitions as possible, which is exactly what they do. But coming into the veto, the only sense of suspense there comes from Gary talking about the struggle of whether or not to use the veto if he wins it, and during his DRs from the veto comp, he does talk about how he is going to use it, though obviously those were filmed after he had already lost it, so I'm not fully convinced he was going to. But either way, Emmett ends up winning there instead in a comp that has them transporting water through their helmets, and we get this notable scene of Emmett and Jillian kissing under the water. But this clearly solidifies that Suzette is going home, but Suzette gets completely dunked in the edit along the way, with everyone talking about their annoyances with her, and we see her still complaining about why do people look at me as a big threat, and Emmett in particular is used to voice their annoyances, calling her out for guilt tripping, to where they even flash back to random conversations of her talking about how she has no money for her kids and that she should be given a trip for the emotional turmoil the show has put her through. And in the veto ceremony, we have Emmett calling her out for this and also being self-centered, and really does it in a bit of a harsh way, where again she does get really insulted by this, leading to a bit of a fight between the two. And while I do agree with Emmett's sentiment for a lot of this is also again pretty dickish behavior from him, to where on the rewatch I do think you really notice a lot more moments like this where Emmett just has no bedside manner, to where I think this is definitely one of his bigger flaws that I do think might backfire on him if he were to play again, but again is something that doesn't matter on this season. But beyond this, we get some fun segments like Tala giving Topaz a bikini wax, and while Topaz is screaming, we have Gary dancing around the room. We also get the return of Marsha the Moose, to where she gives a task to AJ of him having to make a workout routine, and get some funny lines here like form doesn't matter and always jog, never run. He tells them to take their time with the course and tells Andrew that he's going too fast. And again, all of this is just kind of ridiculous. But also we do see some relationship drama between Alec and Topaz, where BB confiscates his music due to her sleeping to it. And this is used to transition to Alec being okay with letting Topaz go at this point, encouraging Emmett to put her up the following week. And Topaz and Gary end up being the targets for the majority of the house for the following week. And all of this is really bad for the Shield. Again, they are just too blindly loyal to Emmett here, and in turn are willing to get rid of their own numbers, while he is setting up his numbers to take a strike at them. Now, the final segment before the actual eviction ends up being one where we get this dinner party for the noms, and the players end up having to break piñatas, where one player gets a power and Gary gets the power to replace a veto competitor, which is a pretty useless power that doesn't come to effect, but it's funny how this is just randomly dropped in here. But again, once we get to the eviction, pretty clearly Suzette is going home. And again, I found Suzette really annoying on this season. I didn't like her the first time I watched the season, and I didn't like her now. I found her to be a player with a massive lack of self-awareness and a complete inability to play the game strategically without her game being clouded by emotions. And even beyond that, her personality is just extremely grating to me. Like, I really just found Suzette extremely insufferable across this season, and I think she played a pretty terrible game, with literally the entire house agreeing to get rid of her here just so that she's out before jury. And I think she is a terrible player here, and one that would probably struggle in most casts. Now for week 6, the start of the jury phase of the game, and a week that starts with one of the most controversial twists in the history of the show, and that being the instant eviction, which in general to me is a terrible twist that just screws over the person booted within it, as they don't have a chance to fight for themselves. But the way that this one in particular is handled is completely asinine, to the point where production completely breaks trust with its players, to where from this point forward, it would become tough to trust anything that production said. And this really just sets a terrible precedent for seasons moving forward, but all of this does start with Topaz winning HOH, which would have been a pretty interesting result here, as Topaz and Gary were the targets coming into this round, and this would have been a great opportunity for her to target Jillian and Emmett and try to get Alec and Peter back on their side. But again, there is no time for her to talk to the others, as instantly Topaz is called into the HOH room, where she is told to make nominations in 5 minutes. And she has to make that decision without leaving the room, only for us to cut to the living room, where the TV turns on, allowing the remaining players to watch Topaz in the 5 minutes leading up to her decision. Again, without telling Topaz that the other players are watching, and leading to her essentially revealing her entire game as she runs through her possible nominations. And it gets to the point where even Emmett and Jillian, who are opposed to Topaz at this point, are saying that this twist sucks and that it's unfair. And again, Topaz's game was not in a good position before this, but this does harm her ability to recuperate afterwards, and just sets a terrible precedent of you not being able to trust what production is saying moving forward. That makes it so savvy players should end up holding back from production due to the worry of things like this happening. Especially with the worst part of all this being that after Topaz makes her nominations, Arissa asks her why, and these answers were shown to the others, where the part of like Topaz thinking out loud, at least that part was unprompted, but this is literally her being prompted by the host of the show to blow up her game, which is just extremely unfair. But Topaz here ends up nominating Andrew and AJ, with Andrew as her very clear target. But then we get the players learning that this is not only an instant nomination, but also an instant eviction, where the players are now forced to vote without being able to talk or give any speeches. And I've already said how unfair this initial nomination process was, especially to Topaz, but really all this is just not fair to not just the nominees, but really everyone. Where obviously it is for noms in particular, as obviously they don't have any time to campaign for themselves, but also as for the others, they don't have any time to properly think through their plan, which plays a role here into the downfall of the Shield, where you see Andrew being the target. However, only Gary and Tala end up voting for him, while Emmett and Jillian, along with the Shield, turn their backs on Topaz by keeping Andrew as someone to use use to target Topaz and Gary, which is an optimal move for Emmett and Jillian, who have already started to pull Andrew onto their side, but for Alec and Peter, it doesn't make as much sense. Now, Alec assumes that he has Andrew's loyalty due to him throwing HOH to him, though in reality that's burned his relationship with him, which he doesn't recognize at this point. But also, at this point in the game, they 100% should be loyal to Gary and Topaz here over Emmett and Jillian, where Emmett and Jillian are already starting to plot their demise and set up numbers to go against them, while the numbers of Gary and Topaz didn't have many other options. And again, keeping Andrew in the game ends up alienating Topaz and Gary, which ruins the point of keeping him around to begin with, as the point of keeping him around was for him to do your dirty work for you. And by making this move here, they're getting their hands dirty anyway. I mean, this is a pretty astronomically bad decision here that, again, stems from them just being too blindly loyal to Emmett and siding with him over Topaz, when in reality, again, there's no reason for them to be doing so here. But in turn, we do get this pretty big blindside, leaving AJ to leave the house to an empty audience. And interestingly, here in his interview, he does say that he wants Jillian to win the game, which is obviously a counter to his eventual jury philosophy. But again, we lose AJ, who, kind of sucked at the game. He really didn't bring much to the table. He was looked at as a joke while he was in there, and while he was taken out in a bit of a wonky way, I don't think there was any way he was going to win the game outside of a bitter jury, and he really didn't do much in the game, which is weird considering the fact that he was one of the bigger fans on this cast. But even from a character standpoint, while he did have a couple humorous moments here and there, most of those did seem to be at his expense. Well, really, he was just one of the more under-edited figures on the season, and really just one that I don't think anyone took too seriously. But let's move on to the rest of the week, where we do get a lot of focus on the ramifications of the incident, with Topaz now being the clear target, and we have Peter mocking her in confessional for speaking out loud and calls her a moron, which again really makes you roll your eyes there. But again, we see Topaz confronting Alec about how he screwed her over, but this all leads up to the HOH, which ends up being the worst possible result for Topaz, with Andrew winning the HOH. With him getting to pick the have-nots as well, he does end up picking Gary and Topaz, which leads to another of Gary's more notable moments here of him throwing a tantrum, running off bawling, and we see Emmett laughing at him, but later consoles him by saying, you will lose weight, to which Gary says, F you. He also says, my life is gourmet, and again, all this is a really fun scene, but obviously the noms end up being Topaz and Gary, with Gary thinking he is the pawn, though in reality he is the target, obviously due to him being pretty much a bigger threat in every conceivable way. Though I will say that while Emmett has started to run the game at this point, I actually don't necessarily agree with his move here to target Gary over Topaz, where Topaz clearly jumps back to Alec and Peter across this week, while Gary again continues to talk about how much he loves Emmett and was more likely to work with him than Alec and Peter. So I don't think this was the optimal move, though realistically not a game-ending one, as Gary is still a threat in his own right. Now, the veto comp ends up being sponsored by the Evil Dead reboot, which leads to this horror set piece that really the challenge itself was kind of lame and kind of tough to follow, but at least it looked cool, with set pieces like this becoming the norm moving forward in BB Can. And Andrew ends up winning the veto here, keeping the noms the same, and securing Gary going home. But this is another week with a lot of setup for the following round, where this is where we do see Emmett, Jillian, and Andrew officially form the Beast Coast Alliance, and fully forming plans to target the Shield in the following round. But this sets up the house in a 3v3 with Tala in the middle, and we do see a lot of jockeying for her loyalty, with Peter trying to pull her in and assuming that he has her in his pocket, but in reality Tala does end up siding with the Beast Coast Alliance, with him doing a lot more actively to try to get her on their side. We do see Andrew taking Tala with him to the Evil Dead screening he won, which is a humorous scene of her screaming at every twist and turn, though funnily it actually turns into drama later on, with Tala being so scared that she doesn't want to sleep by herself, so she sleeps in Alec's bed, leading to Topaz getting jealous, and Topaz calling her a slut, which was obviously not a good look for Topaz there. But here we do see Emmett put in some effective work as well, where we do see a fight between Tala and Gary, where Emmett jumps into the fender. Well, probably his most important work of this week here is that he ends up telling Jillian to make an alliance with Tala, which ends up being a very important relationship for Jillian moving forward, being an integral reason of why Jillian ends up winning against Gary at the end, but is also something that is once again questionable from Emmett's perspective, where I have criticized Peter and Alec for taking out their own numbers, these numbers that were close to them. But this is a situation where Emmett is essentially doing a similar thing. He is pigeonholing himself into a similar position where, despite Emmett being the one to put this alliance together, it is an alliance that he himself is not that well positioned within, where the only person here taking him the final two is Jillian, where while Emmett is the one to bring in Andrew and Tala into the alliance initially, they both end up being closer to Jillian, and Tala straight up talks about wanting Emmett out first out of the alliance, and even Andrew had points about talking about potentially taking Tala to final two, which in turn would leave Emmett on the outs. So again, while Emmett does control most of the action moving forward, I do think his positioning within his alliance is one of the greatest flaws of his game, though it does end up biting him due to the fact that him and Jillian end up winning out from this point to the final three anyway. But again, this week does feel like these two sides prepping for a battle, though even here, the Shield are still planning on targeting Andrew instead of Emmett and Jillian, talking about flipping on them at the final five, which is just insane to think that no one would make a move up to that point. All while Alec is already primed to be the target for the Beast Coast Alliance before the Gary eviction here, but Gary goes out in a unanimous vote, with the crowd clearly being disappointed along the way, back to when BB Can didn't control their audiences, but obviously this adoration that he has from the public ends up bringing him back later on, so we'll have more to say about him later. Now let's jump into week 7, the round where these weeks of setup of this Emmett versus the Shield battle finally come to a head, and we started off with a really great HOH comp, being BB Can's version of the wall, which I will say looked very cheap, with it being above this like little pond, and the wall itself looked pretty flimsy, but again, the comp itself ends up being pretty great. All this lead up across the last few weeks, culminating in this really intense endurance comp with such a perfect way for it to go. And we do get some notable moments along the way here. I mean, Alec tries to pull a Boogie by saying, "You remember Richard Hatch?" Obviously, as Boogie said in All Stars, though he doesn't throw the comp here, though he does later end up dropping out thinking that he is safe, which obviously ends up being a bad read from him. But Peter drops pretty soon afterwards as well, essentially making it the East Coast Alliance against Topaz. And also this entire time, Emmett had been using this strat of him nearly sitting down in a way that it felt very wonky that this was allowed rules-wise, but eventually he ends up accidentally letting go anyway. And it does eventually come down to Jillian versus Topaz, and this is a great showdown, which ends with Emmett telling Jillian to make a deal, leading to them agreeing to keep each other and their showmances off the block, and she gets Topaz to drop out, giving Jillian her second HOH win. Now, a couple things here. Obviously, it was really dumb of Topaz to drop out here. Supposedly, she could have gone for a lot longer while Jillian was already struggling and on her way out. So, for her to be the one to drop here was pretty bad. But also, Jillian makes this deal here and later goes back on every aspect of it, which is essentially the start of her losing trajectory, where obviously she doesn't lose, but realistically she was in a position where she would have lost against everybody at the end, and the jury actually made a pact to not let her win. And while from a positioning standpoint she didn't have many other options than to break some sort of deal that she had going, I do think this plays into her wishy-washy persona that they assumed of her, to where they don't think she played the game intentionally, which harms her jury perception. Though considering the makeup of the jury, I think most of them were just genuinely bitter about not wanting to vote for her because they felt outplayed. But this ends up being a pretty massive moment for Jillian's game, as it leaves her drawing near dead afterwards. But instantly Jillian does talk about having to break this deal and tells the rest of her alliance about it, and intends on putting up Alec and Peter to send Alec out. And Alec certainly doesn't help his case here, where he does have a one-on-one with Jillian, being extremely awkward during it, where she alludes to him possibly going up, and he ends up telling her that that's not a good way to run your HOH, and that if he goes up then he's gonna look for other options. Where I just feel like Alec just completely misjudged his relationships at this point. I think he had way more leverage than he actually had. But interestingly, Peter later campaigns for himself and tries to get Topaz backdoored, which following this talk, Peter says that he wants Jillian, Emmett, or Alec to win this game, an opinion of his that obviously does not last. Not even beyond the nominations at this point, where Peter's already saying immediately afterwards that he wants to go to the end with Jillian now, as she can't win the game. But either way, the Shield ends up getting nominated here, to where it is now that Alec realizes the bad move he made in keeping Andrew around and not trusting Topaz, and finally says that he's going to target Jillian and Emmett. Too bad it's 2 rounds late. But Alec ends up taking the blame for that decision, and I do think that heavily weighs on him coming into the veto, which ends up being a pretty notable one here, where the players go one at a time, and Peter is in the lead by the time Alec goes, with him being the last to go, and clearly having a time that would easily hand him the win. Though right before he ends up putting in the final piece, Alec decides to quit the competition, essentially handing the veto to Peter, which obviously left a lot of people perplexed. I mean, Emmett even gets a DR calling him an idiot, but again, I do feel like this stems from Alec feeling bad for putting Peter in this position, so he wanted to save him there, but also, I do think part of this also stems from the fact that, again, Alec loved Will and Dan, and I do think this was him trying to pull off a move similar to them, where he wanted to leave himself on the block, and if he was able to save himself when he was dead to rights, I do think that would have been his ideal situation. I think that is what he was thinking at this point. Now again, at the end of the day, it is a terrible strategic move, but clearly he wasn't really thinking strategically in this position. And I think even he recognized that. Now, this comp does also provide another fun Tala meltdown with her timing out. But again, Peter does win the veto, and now Jillian has to pick a renom, which she quickly decides on Topaz. And with that, she is now fully going against her deal, again, further ruining her perception with the jury, and also losing Topaz's jury vote, at least theoretically. But the renom doesn't really matter here, as Alec remains the target, and despite his constant campaigning to Emmett, it never ends up going anywhere. But along the way, we do get some interesting tasks this week, with BB taking all of their food, and each player being given a specific task to complete, which is where we do get some ridiculousness, from Jillian licking peanut butter off of Alec's chest. We also get Andrew having to wear a maid costume. Peter has to eat a salad, to which he throws it up. But the most notable of all this to me is Emmett having to drink 5 glasses of milk, to which he ends up puking it back up. But again, it is a fun sequence, and we also get the return of Marsha the Moose, but this time as a dark moose in the hot tub area, where Peter is now told to pretend that Tom is returning to the game, to which Peter ends up saying that it's not fair for us that have been here for weeks to have someone coming back to the game, which again, I feel like his opinion changes on that. But either way, Alec didn't have a chance at surviving here, and Alec is a really interesting player across this season, being this massive super fan of the show, and was actually playing pretty well for the first few weeks of the game. But I do think that despite his talk about how he was running the game, he just made it too obvious how strategic he was, and how he was utilizing players as pawns, and along with his blind loyalty to Emmett, it ends up being this recipe for disaster here. But I do think the context of how he was playing was pretty interesting, where again, he was a fan of Dr. Will, and was essentially trying to be the BB Can Dr. Will, and cared a lot about the legacy of BB Can moving forward, and I do feel like that greatly influenced some of his decisions, including his jury decision, which we will later talk about. But this week doesn't end here, as this is also where we get our second double eviction of the season, which ends up being a somewhat controversial one. But it does start with an HOH, where Topaz and Peter are out right away, and after a long string of the same answers between Andrew and Emmett ends up winning his first HOH, which starts the streak of what will be a Jillian Emmett back-to-back HOH wins. But here we do see Emmett make a very questionable decision in nominating Topaz and Tala, not nominating Peter in this position, where if Peter had won the veto, as he does, and used it on Topaz, that would have given Peter and Topaz the leverage at that point to potentially flip the entire game. And people always talk about how Peter not using the veto here was a really terrible move, but don't also mention the fact that this was such a terrible move for Emmett to open up this potential situation here. And through Emmett not putting up Peter here, it kind of justifies the way that Peter is looking at the game right now, where he does once again trust Emmett too much in this position, where if he had just used the veto, he could have taken the game by the reins, picking up Topaz and Tala and moving forward with them, but he doesn't and lets Topaz go, which I do think that aspect of it, you do have the credit to Emmett, where despite his initial mistake of opening up this possibility, he then rectifies it by being the one to convince Peter to not use the veto. But also, Peter isn't necessarily wrong in his read here. While it is obviously a missed opportunity, at this point, Emmett was being genuine with him. Emmett did want to take Peter to the end with Jillian, as at this point, Emmett had recognized that Peter was the only player that would potentially take him to the end. So while, yes, this is a bad move from Peter, I don't think it is a move without merit. But again, this also just shows you the rockiness of Emmett's game, with his putting up of Tala as the pawn here, does end up severing his ties with her to where she is targeting him from this point forward. And while she never gets the opportunity, I do think overall this move was pretty suboptimal. But with Peter not using the veto on Topaz, Topaz is pretty dead to rights and goes out pretty anticlimactically here. And Topaz has an interesting legacy in BB Can. Obviously, the biggest part of her legacy has yet to come, but up to this point, she is a player that seemed to have a level of potential with her, having a decent strategic read at points, but was just never able to maintain the social capital to do anything about it. And to be fair, she's still not great. I mean, she didn't make the move on Jillian Emmett when she could have. She made the deal with Jillian and dropped out when that was unnecessary, and also ends up being a pretty confrontational and emotional figure at points that makes her, again, a really middling player by the end of it, but none of that is remembered because all people remember is her eventual jury vote. Now let's jump into week 8, which ends up being one of the weaker weeks of the show, but it does start with Jillian winning her third HOH comp in what is the Caged Eggs comp from BBUS, which gives us this ridiculous celebration from her freaking out with this chicken head on. But we do get a lot from Tala and Andrew being sketched out by Emmett's move during the double, which Emmett and Jillian state that they didn't realize how disastrous that could have turned out, which I will say I do believe. I mean, Emmett and Jillian were both not big fans of Big Brother coming into the season, and I think it is pretty reasonable to think that neither of them had thought about this possibility. And even later, we do see Peter having to tell Emmett about the possibility of the non-nominated player using the veto that could potentially screw him. And I think these intricacies in the game are things that Emmett and Jillian both overlooked, considering the fact that they just did not know the game that well. But either way, with Jillian as the HOH, she already knows she is nominating Peter. The big dilemma for her is who to put up next to him. And Jillian and Andrew's initial thoughts are to put up Tala. But this is where we do see Emmett, again, doing some decent work here and recognizing that it benefits him to keep Peter around, and starts to try to make Andrew the target instead, and also ends up using this information Peter gave him to get Jillian to put up Andrew initially, as he is more likely to win the veto and potentially screw him over. Though I will say that I don't think Andrew is ever going to go through with that here, though Andrew is surprised when he is eventually put on the block, insulted that Tala isn't being used as a pawn, considering she's the weak link in the alliance. But again, Andrew was the actual target at this point, which would have been a terrible move for Jillian, though obviously she is convinced to go through with it due to Emmett. None of this matters anyway, as Andrew ends up winning the veto, nullifying all these plans, but the veto ends up being a really notable one here, with Emmett ending up giving Jillian advice after he finishes the first round, which was against the rules, leading to him getting DQ'd. Which, I mean, again, is pretty normal for Emmett, but he ends up taking this really hard, throwing a tantrum, which was a really bad look for him, but also humorous considering he is wearing this pajama costume while doing so. But also Peter ends up coming off pretty immature here as well, with him breaking his brush when he thinks that he's out, only for him to not be out and get to the second round, only for him to lose in a slide puzzle there to Jillian and end up breaking his puzzle after doing so. So again, all not a good look for him either, but obviously Andrew ends up winning the veto. Tala is the renom, and Peter is pretty screwed at this point, with the edit really leaning into this being his swan song. And along the way, we do get him blasting the other players in the game, calling Jillian a liar, calling Tala undeserving, which is, again, interesting considering future events. Also calls Andrew lucky, but also says that it was an honor to play with Emmett. Once again, an opinion that changes moving forward. But Emmett does still want to keep Peter around at this point, especially with Tala coming after him, but Jillian does end up getting her way here for one of the few times in this season, where again, most times there's debate between Jillian and Emmett. Emmett ends up getting his way, though here we do see her recognize that Peter's only good for Emmett's game and not hers. Though even then, there is actually a point where Peter uses Tala's words against her to get Jillian to distrust Tala and consider keeping him around, though obviously that doesn't stick. But I really do think Peter gives it a valiant effort here. But along the way, we do also get a couple notable moments for the show, with this being where the players are told to freeze and they're given a number of things to distract them, with the most notable which being Andrew's twin brother coming into the house, which ends up being a pretty emotional moment there. Also, in the lead up to the eviction, we get this awkward conversation between Jillian and Peter, with Jillian telling him that he's going home, and he ends up threatening her with jury votes, which is never an effective strategy, as this makes the person you threaten want you out even more for having the gall to do this. And usually this is an empty threat, though in this situation, it actually ends up being a reality, with Peter being one of the main proponents of this pact to not have Jillian win. But Peter's eviction here is really awkward, where he ends up giving this bizarre poem on his way out that, I'll be honest, I don't even understand what he was talking about. And again, in his interview with Larissa, he does say that he hopes for Emmett to win, which again doesn't hold. But again, we do lose Peter here, who is a very complex figure across this season. One that is very polarizing, where a lot of people are annoyed by his overconfident personality. Though again, I feel like a lot of that is just an act. I feel like a lot of that is him trying to play up this heel role on their show. But also people are annoyed by how much credit the show gives him. That can come off as unwarranted. And again, I do think part of that is true. I do think some of his accomplishments did get overblown at some point. But I do think it's gotten to the point where I think people overblow how much that it props him up. Where again, a lot of people call him a terrible player when again, that's simply just not the case. I think he is one of the better players on the board here. Even in his eventual boot week here, he just gets unlucky with Andrew winning the veto that ends up sending him home. And despite him coming off as obnoxious at points, even at points moving forward, at least he tries to make good TV and was able to play up this character in the DR. And through that, does end up being one of the more notable figures from this season. But now for week 9, which starts off with this big twist, the last Chevrolet power shift of the season, in that a jury member is returning to the game. And that returning player ends up being picked by Canada, which is a ridiculous twist here, allowing someone to re-enter the game at the Final Four in a position where they had just spent time with most of the jury, essentially handing them a guaranteed win as long as they get to the end, which again, they are very close to. And along with that, by being voted in by Canada, they are essentially told that they are loved by Canada, something they can use to their advantage after coming into the house as well, along with the jury information they can use to their advantage. Again, this is a twist that ridiculously benefits the person coming back into the game in such an unfair way, in a similar way to how the Edge of Extinction is flawed in Survivor. And I do think it is this twist that further cements this pact that ends up forming in the jury, to where they end up having a massive proponent for them to be sticking together to support. Before seeing the player that ends up re-entering, we do end up seeing the jury house, with them already being extremely anti-Jillian, with AJ having already switched, despite being pro-Jillian on his way out. Though interestingly, we do see him say, once Gary joins the jury, that he is happy to see him, as he wants some of his friends in the house to win the game, which again, another opinion that has not aged well. But when it comes to the public vote, I mean, obviously it wasn't a question. Obviously Gary was getting back in there, again, being an insanely popular figure at this point, where I would even say it feels like this twist was pretty much catered towards him. And Gary ends up re-entering the house, to which he gets a pretty awkward entrance without any setup from Marissa. And initially this is clearly meant to be a revolving door situation, with all the players in the house being very annoyed at Gary's return and wanting him out right away, leading us to the HOH comp, where Emmett ends up winning the HOH, which probably ends up being Gary's second best outcome here, as Emmett would be the most likely to keep him around, considering how much Emmett wanted Andrew gone at this point in the game. And we also get a lot of content from Andrew here about him being so pissed that they would bring someone back, and being angry at how many twists there are, which, I mean, thank God he was on BB Can 3. But instantly we see Emmett realize that having Gary back gives him more options moving forward, particularly a better chance of getting rid of Andrew here. So we do see Emmett fully bringing Gary in, something that he should have done before Gary's first eviction. But once again, Emmett comes off as a bit of a dick in these scenes, with him talking to Gary in a very demeaning way, just telling him what to do and telling him to shut up, calling him a child. And again, don't know if his tactics here would be effective on most people, but for some reason Gary ends up taking it, and through that they end up making a final 2, which ends up being the basis around Emmett keeping Gary in the game up to the final 3, a decision that obviously comes back to bite him. But at this point, it's not an insane thought. I mean, obviously you still have to worry about Gary winning a jury vote, but considering how anti-returning everyone in the house was, I do think Emmett was misguidingly thinking that the rest of the jury was also thinking that way as well, when in reality it was obviously the opposite. And obviously this backfires on him even more when Gary ends up cutting Emmett at the very end. But at this point, Gary was being genuine to him, to where it wasn't until a certain other event of the week that Gary starts to think about not taking him to the end. But also another factor into Emmett's decision making here is, again, the fact that Emmett's HOH letter keeps telling him that his family loves Gary, continuing to signal to Emmett that Gary is to be trusted, which again at this point he technically was. Though this is also where Gary starts to put some of his jury information to use by lying about both Emmett and Jillian being big jury threats in order to further secure Emmett's loyalty. Again, it is something that really gives Gary an unfair advantage at this point in the game, being able to manipulate jury information while also being the only one to know the reality of the situation. But the noms end up being pretty easy here and putting up Andrew and Gary, the same strat that was used the previous week in keeping Tala off the block because she's not going to win the veto to screw them over. Though there is a point where Andrew finds out that he's going on the block and Jillian ends up feeling bad to the point where she considers putting herself on the block, which is obviously really bad, though again, realistically, I don't think there was a way for her to go home here, as I don't think Tala or Andrew were ever voting her out in this position. And while I do think it was the optimal move for Emmett to get rid of Andrew here, Andrew was actually loyal to Emmett and Jillian in this position and did want to go to the final 3 with them, which does make his eventual downfall here feel even more tragic, feeling like a more likable version of Tom. Though across this week, he does come off as a bit of a curmudgeon, and he does get into fights with Tala, with him getting increasingly frustrated at how she's getting a free ride. But then we get to one of the most fascinating aspects of this week, in that the players get a visitor that they are told to use as they see fit, and it turns out to be Dan Giesling, obviously the winner of Big Brother 10 and the runner-up of BB14, which again was the last BBUS season to finish airing, which is really surreal looking back on this, that they actually let the debatably best player and manipulator in the history of Big Brother to enter a house where he's not playing for himself and just allow him to coach other people's games without any true vested interest in how they do. And through this, he ends up having a massive influence on how this game ends up playing out, where while he is there, he does have these one-on-ones with each of the players and gives them his thoughts on their games, which I will say that really a lot of this does come off as pretty awkward, considering most of the people left in the game at this point were not fans of BBUS. I mean, Tala and Andrew were the only fans left, and they were more casual fans, while the likes of Emmett, Jillian, and Gary all knew very little about the show coming into it. I think they barely even knew who Dan was, and Emmett himself even calls him some rando. But instantly Dan recognizes the stranglehold that Emmett has here and starts questioning everybody why they aren't targeting him, with this being particularly effective on Gary, who before talking to Dan had never talked about the possibility of him cutting Emmett, but afterwards does start to think about the possibility of taking Jillian to the end instead as the easier beat. Now, at the end of the day, I don't think it really matters, as it's really just a difference of does Emmett get second or third place. But this is the point where Emmett's reads on Gary start to look even worse due to the fact that Gary is starting to change his mind. Though again, a lot of that does seem to stem from Emmett getting unlucky that Dan Giesling, of all people, talks some sense into him. But while Dan is there, he also ends up hosting the veto comp, which is one I've always liked, of players having to take punishments to get points. And here we do see Emmett trying to pretend that he's trying by just slapping the podium, which I found funny. But it really is a battle between Andrew and Gary, with Gary being the one quicker at pushing the button, at which he wins the veto and fully confirms that Andrew is going home, with Tala being the renom, during which we do get some fights between Andrew and Tala, where again he's insulted that she called him a snake, and he seems to get genuinely pissed in a way that we hadn't really seen before from Andrew. But also here we do get a fun segment from Tala for getting tasked by Marsha the Moose to host the talk show, where again we get some humorous dodo content for Tala here, but it's also a great opportunity for us to get more Emmett is a dick content, with him calling her out for not being able to string a sentence together. And then Emmett is clearly annoyed throughout this entire scene, and when he's being interviewed, he just kind of refuses to talk. But anyway, before the vote, we do end up seeing Jillian wanting to keep Andrew here, knowing that he would take her to the end, though Emmett sticks to his guns here, and Andrew ends up getting blindsided. And with that, let's talk about Andrew, who I've always found to be a likable presence on this season, and one that is a solid player as well. While he is too blindly loyal to Jillian and Emmett across this season, and is really an honor-bound player, he does have some decent strategic sense, and if he were to able to get past his blind loyalty, I do think he could be a very good player. And if he had been right about Emmett wanting to take him to 3, he would have been in a decent spot to win, considering he was always intending on taking Jillian to the end and would have just needed to win that final HOH to do so, and he would have ended up beating her. The problem is that I don't think he beats many other people, where again, this pact from the jury was to make sure that one of Emmett, Jillian, and Andrew would not win, though obviously with Jillian being the most hated of the bunch, but he himself was also not that respected by the jury, so his game on this season was certainly flawed. But again, this season obviously has extenuating circumstances, and really as a whole, I do think he is a solid player and also a decent character here, though one that I don't think has stood the test of time, to where I feel like almost no one talks about him anymore. But with that, let's get into the final week of the show, which starts with the final 4 round, where we do see Jillian winning her final HOH of the season, which is a Q&A comp that starts this terrible trend from BB Can of not finishing the HOH in the eviction episode and dragging out to the following one. But obviously, final 4 HOH doesn't matter that much outside of just handing someone immunity and literally giving that person no say in who eventually ends up going home. Now, this is also where we do get the BB Can Awards, which is BB Can's version of a clip show. That is obviously just filler for the show, but it is nice to see them put some effort into making the clip show have more purpose here. But beyond that, we do get some interesting dynamics here, with this being Emmett's biggest danger point since week 1, with Tala for sure voting out Emmett in this position, and Gary would have even debatably done so. So Emmett was actually in a lot of danger here, but he does end up winning the veto anyway, and this is where we do get this controversial decision, where he does decide to vote out Tala over Gary, which obviously backfires on him, and through that people say that this is a terrible decision. But based on the information that he had, I understand the rationale for it. One is the fact that Gary would obviously take him to the end, which again, Emmett is misguided in thinking that he would beat Gary, but he did think that voting out Tala would essentially guarantee his position in the final 2. But even beyond that, there is logic here in taking out Tala for Emmett and Jillian as a duo here, where they were assuming that part 1 of the HOH would have been a more standard endurance comp, as it typically is in the US, one that Tala would probably be very good at, to where they were banking on Jillian winning the part 1 endurance while banking on Emmett to win the part 2 physical comp. And they were more worried about Tala in the endurance comp than they were about Gary facing off against Emmett in the physical comp. So again, there is logic here in taking out Tala, especially because Tala was also proven to do well in Q&As and worried about her winning that final HOH. More so than Gary, but obviously none of this ends up playing out to their favor, as they get unlucky in part 1 being more upper body focused than pure endurance, and in turn makes the decision look a lot worse in retrospect, where Tala clearly would have no chance in the part 1 and part 2 that we end up seeing. But based on the information that they had at this point, I understand why they made this choice, especially with this theoretically booning Emmett's position as well. But I do think if it was me personally making this decision, I would just worry about Gary's overall compatibility and also his win equity from the jurors having spent time with him, to where I obviously would have sided the opposite way. But again, I do get why he makes this decision in voting out Tala here, in a position where he does tell her beforehand, and with Dan having given him his bracelet to indicate that he thought he was playing the best game, Emmett ends up using this to his advantage here, giving it away to Tala here as a way of jury management, which is a pretty savvy move, though one that doesn't seem to matter, as I don't think there was any way Tala was voting for Emmett at the end, considering how angry she still ended up being. But again, I think this is a pretty innovative move, especially for someone that had no real game knowledge coming into the season. But Tala is a strange figure in BB Can history to me. Obviously a massive character at the time, brings so many notable, ridiculous moments to the show, but one that is also never taken seriously as a player, and is really a player that didn't do that much in the game. And she played in self-preservation mode for most of the season while also being on the outs, and did not have much agency in the game. But despite that, she was somehow the biggest jury threat on the board outside of Gary, which, again, a lot of this comes from the fact that this pact that was formed in the jury and wanted to not reward Emmett, Jillian, or Andrew with the win, to which they claim that they would vote for Tala, as in that situation, it would stem from them being very cocky and thinking that if they brought Tala to the end, they would get an easy win, so they wanted to dispel their hubris by giving the win to Tala. But again, all this is really just due to nothing that Tala did herself. It was just based around this concept of everyone just thinking she was so bad that she was a goat, and the jury not wanting to reward people that took her to the end. So because that, again, Tala is a strange player to assess, considering her massive win equity, despite the fact that she did very little to get that. But with that, we're now at the finale, which is a very explosive one, debatably one of the best in the history of Big Brother, and it all starts with this final 3 round, where again we see the first part of the final HOH, which ends up being this more upper body intensive comp than expected, using this pole to hold up a bucket. And with that, Emmett and Jillian's plans are ruined right away, as again they were intending to throw part 1 to Jillian, but Gary ends up outlasting her, forcing Emmett to win part 1 here, leading to a disastrous part 2 for Jillian, where it ends up being an extremely physical one, to where Gary easily wins that, leading us to the Emmett versus Gary battle in the final part. which ends in the most dramatic way possible, with it coming down to the last question, which ironically for Emmett is a question about whether or not Suzette was using her family as strategy for sympathy votes, to which obviously Emmett answers true, showing one of his greatest flaws in his lack of empathy for people, being a battery from Emmett here, giving Gary the HOH, and finally, we do see Emmett being excited, despite this, again, in his mind thinking that Gary's going to take him and he's going to sweep the floor with Gary, so to him it didn't matter that much. But then we cut to the eviction, where Gary ends up evicting Emmett. This massive moment being the first time of the many times moving forward in BB Can history where the player of the season gets cut at the very end, and us getting this very shocking result. Technically, this was a bit more expected than these other Final 3 vote out blindsides like Netta or Betty, but still, to actively see Gary cut Emmett here, despite all the work that Emmett put into getting Gary into this position, is pretty insane. It's such a great downfall for Emmett here. But at the same time, ironically, this decision, despite being the one that is the more optimal one, considering Emmett is the bigger jury threat than Jillian, this ends up actually losing Gary the game, where Jillian in this position does have 3 locked jury votes, to where by Topaz messing up her vote, it actually ends up mattering. While Emmett would have only had 2 locked-in jury votes in Jillian and Andrew, to where Tala was a lot less incentivized to vote for Emmett, and I do think she probably would have voted for Gary, to which obviously Topaz's vote wouldn't have mattered in that situation, though even if Tala did vote for him, Topaz wouldn't have been as angry at Emmett as she was with Jillian, to where I don't think she would have lost focus while giving her dig like she did in the real life scenario. So again, I do think this fully loses Gary the game, but obviously in a way that he couldn't have expected. But with that, let's talk about Emmett, who I will say my opinion of his game on this rewatch did go down. I think there are many points in this game where despite Emmett having a lot of control, he makes decisions that I don't necessarily agree with. And to go along with that, he has an extremely cold personality, and that despite this cast seeming to adore him while in the game, I don't think this personality resonates with most casts. But considering he knew very little about Big Brother coming into the season, I do think he is an extremely gifted player. Again, if this is Emmett before learning the game, I do think it would be insane to see how well he would do if he actually knows the game coming into it. I mean, in many ways, the way I look at him as a player is very similar to how I look at Sarah Lucina in Survivor, a player that is naturally gifted at the game and the social aspects of it, and while their charisma doesn't necessarily translate to the show, he is a player that is clearly able to amass a ridiculous amount of social capital on this season. But even beyond that, he has the cutthroat nature that Sarah Lucina has, but also has an ego to him to where it can get in his way and cloud his judgment, particularly in underestimating the players around him. And again, I just feel like there's so many similarities between the two in how they approach the game. But again, despite these flaws, he is still an extremely effective player here, to where if he were to play again and demonstrate a level of improvement, I do think he could be back in the conversation for best player in BB Can history. But now we're at the final 2, where we do have Jillian versus Gary, which is probably one of the most complex final 2 scenarios that we have ever seen. I mean, typically by this point in the season, I don't have much to say. There just simply is the vote result. But here, there is so much to say. And all this leads to us talking about was having one of the most complex and divided juries in the history of the show, while also it all leading up to one of the most iconic moments in the history of the show. But again, obviously the main point of intrigue here does stem from what happened on the jury, where again, I have talked about this already, but the majority of the jury on this season, namely the first 4 jurors in AJ, Alec, Topaz, and Peter, made a pact to agree to vote together to decide who will win this game, with their main priorities being to make sure Gary wins if he gets to the end, but also to make sure that Jillian loses, making this the ideal final 2 for this grouping as it allows them to accomplish both goals at one time. But we have also learned post-show that this pact goes beyond just Gary and Jillian, and again spreads to Emmett and Andrew as 2 people that they wanted to make sure didn't win either, and again would have rewarded Tala the win if she had gotten to the end against anybody but Gary. And I know a lot of people have criticized the Shield for being bitter in this situation, and yeah, they are. I think that is undeniable. I do think they were upset at the concept that these players that they looked down on and that were beneath them ended up being the ones to beat them at their own game. These players that didn't know Big Brother that well, but still were able to outmaneuver them. These players that they had multiple opportunities to vote out, but didn't, and got outplayed by them. And with that, they all just amount that to luck. And again, straight up, they were bitter. And that is a lot of the basis around the pact that they end up making. However, I don't have an issue with them making a pact on the jury, which seems to be a major source of controversy. But again, to me, it is in the right of the jury members to make this pact. I mean, the point of the game is to have the jury reward you with the win, and the individual members of the jury can do whatever they want with their jury votes, including getting together and coordinate their jury votes in a specific way to make sure they get the eventual winner they want. Again, I don't see an issue with this, as it is, again, on the players in the game to manage the jury to the point where they wouldn't do this sort of thing against you. And obviously there are points where things like this are unavoidable due to the players that you're playing with, but really that's just the level of variance that is there with every season. I don't have an issue with this concept of the pact, especially when you consider that, again, this is the first ever season of Big Brother Canada. And with Alec and Peter being the main constituents of this plan, they were trying to mold the game in their image. They wanted to reward the winner that represented the way that they wanted BB Can to be moving forward, and they wanted to set the tone for the series. I think they didn't want to reward a comp beast, as again, that would nullify their view of players like Will and Dan being the best. Also, part of this is them wanting to reward the fan favorite of the season. Again, like Alec and Peter are both fans of BBUK as well, where that is a show that is determined by a public vote. And I do think that plays a factor here in them wanting to embrace the OG Big Brother format and differentiate BBUS from BB Can. And again, Gary is a perfect representative for those things. So again, I don't have an issue with them going to these lengths to guarantee the winner that they wanted. My issue stems from the fact that they still don't admit to the fact that they were bitter and that it played a major influence into their state of mind. Again, it is fine to be bitter. It is the right of the jury member to be bitter and to be angry at the players remaining in the game and not wanting to reward certain players the win. But what loses respect from me is when people can't own up to that, especially people that are as big of fans as Alec and Peter. And when we add that along with their really obnoxious behavior moving forward, thinking that they had the votes locked up and really just making a mockery of the jury questioning and doing it in a mean-spirited way as well, again, to me, that is what makes this a lot less pleasant of a situation. And we do see this bitterness emanating from the jury during the roundtable, where we do see Alec talking about not respecting Emmett's game, thinking he hadn't done a thing in the game, which, again, Alec himself should know more so than anybody that this is a ridiculous claim, considering how close he was working with Emmett across the season. And also we have the jury questioning, where you can tell that the members of this pact were coordinating their questions to prop Gary up, while also making a mockery of Jillian and really the entire process. And we have AJ asking a joke question to make Jillian look dumb. We have Alec giving a softball question to Gary to allow him to talk about his struggles in life, which I will say Gary performs very well in this jury question. So I will at least give him credit there, but this question in particular was literally just Alec giving him the floor. I mean, we also have Peter doing his thing of mocking Jillian, calling her an idiot and an awful player, to which he asks her to say why she's sitting in the final two without saying the words Emmett and comp wins, to which she obviously ends up bombing the question, though obviously Peter knew she would bomb the question. And you could just see how bitter he looks as he's listening to her answer there. But finally, the final question of this segment comes from Emmett, who comes off as really indignant as well, but obviously this time being bitter at Gary instead of Jillian, which I will say is also equally as bad, though obviously a bit more understandable considering he just got blindsided by Gary. But he ends up saying to Gary that you robbed me of what was mine, and calls him out for needing 2 lives in the Big Brother game. And it's so funny listening to Gary answering his question, and Emmett is just shaking his head while he's answering it, only to be countered by Alec and Topaz applauding to his answer. And again, it really just shows you this divide in this jury, something that is just insane to watch here, something I don't think we ever see, especially up to this point. I mean, we've seen close votes in the past and bitter jury members, but I feel like this is potentially the jury that had the most tension within them and differing rooting interests within them. and you could see that emanating throughout this entire scene. But then we get to the final speeches, where we do see Jillian again floundering in her speech, with her awkwardly not being able to end it in time and asking Arissa for more time. But then Gary gives his speech, which ends up being an all-time great one here. Again, getting really emotional and giving this inspirational speech. That is this iconic moment of him talking about wanting to inspire every girl, boy, and girly boy in Canada. And this was a really great moment for him, again, really exemplifying his character and making him an even more sympathetic figure here. And while, again, I don't think it really mattered as the votes were locked in anyway, but I do think if there were some swing votes in this situation, I do think this is the type of speech that would sway people towards his side, with it being very effective in pulling on people's heartstrings. But then we get to the voting, where this is an incredible scene as well, again, showcasing this divide in the jury. We have AJ calling out Jillian for making a $100,000 mistake. We have Alex saying how he'll be happy how Gary wins this. We have Topaz giving her iconic dig on Jillian, saying she's 150% secure. We have Peter being pretty insufferable again, talking about how his vote is to prevent injustice. But in the counter to all this, we then get Andrew talking about how he's voting with his hearts. We get Tala talking about how she's voting for a person that played the opposite of her game. And then we have Emmett once again coming off so bitter here, and literally his line at the box is, "You should only have one life in the Big Brother game." Still being hung up on that. But afterwards, we do get a pretty boring montage during the reunion segment, only to lead us to the iconic vote reveal, where, again, at this point, it seemed pretty clear that Gary was going to win 4-3, with those 4 specific jury members being very anti-Jillian, and we do get the start of the vote reveal, with the votes going according to plan until we get to Topaz's votes, where it turns out she voted for Jillian, giving us one of the greatest moments in reality TV history, where first in the background we see the confusion from the jury members, leading to Topaz realizing that she voted wrong, yelling out, "Wait a minute, wait, what?" And we get this incredible reaction to the jury when Arissa confirms the vote. We see Andrew sitting there in shock with this massive grin growing on his face. We see Tala and Emmett celebrating, now knowing that Jillian has gotten the win. We see the despair on Alec and Peter's faces, seeing their entire pack crumble around them, making their obnoxious behavior blow up in their faces. And this is probably one of the most satisfying moments in the history of the show to me, to see these two who thought they had gamed the system and worked so hard to make sure Jillian didn't win, only for a freak accident to cause her eventual win. But following this, we have Topaz going up to the voting box, telling Arissa, "Don't do this to me." Also putting into perspective here that this is also Topaz's vote causing all this. Topaz, one of the most bitter jurors against Jillian, accidentally voting for her while also being Gary's best friend, being the reason for his loss here. It is again such an amazing tragedy here that really just boons this entire storyline. But following this, the vote gets confirmed, leading to Andrew having the deciding vote, where Jillian is declared the winner. Again, an insane outcome to this season, the first season of Big Brother Canada. Such a perfect ending, to the point where it does feel scripted. Now, I'm not saying that it is, but for the first season of the show to end with this massive of a moment, the only time in any major social strategy reality show that the winner won the jury vote by pure accident, and really essentially wins due to the faulty voting method, where again, this is an outcome that can only happen in this style of voting, one where you are picking the key with the right name and placing it into the box. Again, if this was Survivor, there you literally write the name down, and that voting format is impossible for this situation to happen. Also, a factor here that I don't think is mentioned is that another clear reason why Topaz ends up voting incorrectly here is due to the lighting. As you could tell, when Topaz gets to the box to vote, she starts covering her eyes, clearly thinking it's too bright, and with the keys also not clearly having the names written on them, instead being embossed on the card, it does make it pretty hard to read in that situation, even in comparison to like how the BBUS format handles it, to where they are printed there in a contrasting color, making it much easier to read. So again, I do think there are a lot of janky things going on here that do lead to this moment, but it is a moment that is still unprecedented and really iconic, something that I don't think will ever be replicated. As again, so many things need to go right for this to happen. There needed to be this pact from the majority of the House to add to the hubris of them leading up to the vote. There needed to be, again, a 4-3 vote to where one of the people in the majority vote incorrectly. And again, this ends up being the only time in the history of the show where the jury themselves as a collective are blindsided by the results. Again, giving us this satisfying conclusion to these jurors who were so resolute in how they were voting due to their bitterness, and in turn turning that into part of the reason that their backed winner doesn't win is a satisfying outcome in that respect, though it also is kind of anticlimactic for the first ever winner of the show to not even genuinely be a winner. So really, it's just a wonky situation all around, where it's, again, like Gary is someone that was extremely lucky to be able to rejoin the game at the Final Four, and in turn shouldn't have been there to begin with. But at the same time, it's also a position where the person who was supposed to win was someone that got voted out and came back into the game very late into the game in a position that greatly benefited them. So it's like, assessing this from a game perspective, I mean, it is extremely conflicting ending to the season, but considering how memorable of an outcome it is, I do think this made up for how middling the raw results are. But to wrap up the season, now let's talk about the final two, starting off with the person who was supposed to be the winner in Gary, who is obviously an extremely iconic figure for BB Can here, being this massive fan favorite, really amazing character, and again, a near winner. Though really, if he had won the show here, he would have been a very abnormal winner, being voted out and obviously coming back into the game. But even beyond that, having a personality that is so out in front that would be the antithesis of the type of people that typically win this format of Big Brother. And for all intents and purposes, he is still the winner of this season. While he doesn't get the title or the money, he technically won the jury vote, only to lose due to human error. Now, if he did win, I still would have considered him one of the worst winners in the history of the show, if not the worst, due to the fact that he was voted out and had to come back into the game. And the game he played before coming back was pretty bad in terms of him being on the outs for most of it and him lacking threat management towards the end. And even coming back, there was really only one opportunity to get rid of him that entire time, which, again, good on him for getting Emmett to trust him in that position. But again, a lot of that was based on Gary actually being loyal to him there, and also a lot of outside influence as well. So again, I do think overall he played a pretty mediocre game on this season and would have had a very bad winning game. But again, as a character, obviously one of the best BB Can has ever seen and ever will see. And with that, let's talk about the winner of the season in Jillian, who is very difficult to assess her game here, as she is a winner that isn't a winner. She, again, for all intents and purposes, did not win this game and realistically had no winning scenarios. Her only winning scenario is this: getting the 3 votes that were the only 3 votes that she was ever going to get, and then having one of the others make a mistake. I mean, she was in reality the biggest GOAT on this entire season. But again, this GOAT won, kind of. And due to her realistically having no chance at winning in any realistic scenario, and only winning due to an unprecedented amount of luck, it does leave Jillian as the worst winner in my eyes, as realistically, she isn't one. Now, if she were a runner-up, or she had actually won the jury vote genuinely, I do think her game would be more middle of the road to me, as I do feel like she really played a second command game to Emmett, with Emmett being the major force strategically. And while there are points where Jillian gets her way, Emmett does end up getting his way more, specifically towards the end game. And it is also Emmett's relationships during the early game that gets him into the position that allows them to outmaneuver the Shield and take control of the game. I mean, even her relationship with Tala is one that she had to be prompted by Emmett in order to make, and considering her poor jury management with the likes of Alec, Topaz, and Peter, and also the fact that she was too passive at the game at points, while also continuously burning jury votes along the way. Again, like, it's not a surprise that the jury hated her and didn't want to reward her with the win, and if she had lost the jury vote, it would have been fully warranted. But she was still in a good position throughout a lot of the season, going into a perfect Final Four situation for her before Gary returned and ended up muddling it up a bit. And at that point, again, like, she lets Emmett run her game, gets rid of her allies in the end game, getting to a pretty bad Final 3 situation for her, being lucked out by the fact that Gary changes his mind and takes her to the end due to nothing that she actually did, and then lucked out in the fact that she gets Topaz's jury vote by freak accident, becoming the first ever winner of Big Brother Canada somehow. But again, it's still someone to me that ends up playing a terrible winning game, as realistically, it wasn't one. So I do think she played a decent second command game to get to the end, which would probably place her as a middle of the pack runner-up. But again, in comparison to all the winners that actually won their jury votes, I feel like Jillian can't even be above any of them in terms of their winning game. And as a player, I do think Jillian is also extremely flawed, where while she is good at competitions and does have a bit of a killer instinct, at least pertaining to people not being Emmett, I just also feel like she was a terrible decision maker and was extremely wishy-washy across the season, making it very open to the others that she was being very wishy-washy, which definitely harmed her jury perception there. She obviously had terrible jury management, and it just felt like she kind of lucked her way into a very good position. So where if she were to play again, I don't know how that would necessarily go. So again, I think she is a solid but deeply flawed player, had a pretty bad winning game, which makes her kind of an underwhelming winner of the season from a gameplay perspective. But considering all the context happening around her, how this jury vote was decided, I do feel like that makes her win a bit more satisfying here. But there we go. I mean, that is the entire season of Big Brother Canada 1, a season that has now shown its age, especially in comparison to recent BB Can seasons, but it's still a really nostalgic season of reality television for me. But it is one that does have some massive high points and some massive low points. I mean, you get some really great weeks, like weeks 3 and 4 that highlight this downfall for Tom. Also, we get the fall of the Shield, which is an interesting storyline, as well as watching Emmett take control of the game and continuously undercutting them. We get iconic characters like Gary, Peter, Tala, and Emmett. We get the most ridiculous outcome to any reality TV season that has ever existed. But with that also comes a number of really unfair twists that ruin the integrity of the game, and also some rounds that have some pretty foreshown results, with the overall gameplay of this season not being as dynamic as what we would see from later seasons. Overall, I do find this season to be a pretty solid middle tier season, one that is still towards the bottom of my BB Can season rankings, though that really just shows you the quality of most BB Can seasons, as again, it is a season that I do mostly enjoy, despite it not feeling like the fully formed product that we know of it today. But with that, those are my thoughts on Big Brother Canada 1. Definitely a longer video than I intended. However, I did feel like there were a lot of fundamentals to run through in this video in particular, but like my other retrospectives, I will be doing a player ranking for BB Can 1 down the road. Also next year, expect me to continue on with this tradition with a similar video for BB Can 2. Also expect the normal content for BB Can 11 moving forward, but for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.